The air over Germany in the winter of 1942 was an electronic wilderness, a new kind of battlefield invisible to the human eye. For the young crews of RAF Bomber Command, climbing into the frigid, oil-stained cabins of their Avro Lancasters and Handley Page Halifaxes, the war had become a duel not just against flak and fighters, but against an unseen, all-seeing eye. The very atmosphere seemed to crackle with a malevolent intelligence. Below, in the darkened landscape of the Third Reich, a network of sophisticated electronic sentinels, the dish-shaped Wurzburg and the larger Freya radar systems, stretched invisible fingers into the night sky. They could pierce the darkness and cloud, guiding the deadly German night fighters with lethal precision to their quarry. Each mission was a descent into an electronic maze where death could come screaming out of the blackness at any moment. The statistics were not just numbers on our operations room chalkboard. They were a cold, hard reality felt in the empty bunks back at the mess. A tour was 30 operations. The chance of surviving it was less than a coin toss. The casualty rates were unsustainable, a slow, grim bleeding of men and machines that threatened to hemorrhage Bomber Command into irrelevance. It was in this shadowed context, within the hushed, panelled corridors of the Air Ministry in London, that a project was born. A project so unusual, so counterintuitive in its very essence, that its existence was restricted to a handful of minds. The very walls, it seemed, were instructed not to listen. Even seasoned RAF group captains, men who directed squadrons from operational airfields, their faces etched with the strain of sending boys to their deaths, were kept in the dark. This was not a weapon born on the drafting tables of Vickers Armstrongs or forged in the fiery crucibles of Sheffield's steel mills. It demanded no new Merlin engines, no complex gyroscopic gun sights, no revolutionary Torpex explosives. It was something far stranger. A device conceived not to rend metal or tear flesh, but to attack perception itself, to strike at the enemy's central nervous system. Its target was the glowing, green eye of the German radar screen, and its purpose was to create a phantom armada, a ghost fleet in the sky that would confound, confuse, and paralyze. The codename was simple, almost deliberately bland, designed to be forgotten if overheard in a corridor or glimpsed on a document, Project Window. But the effect it would have on the air war, on the very psychology of the German defense, was anything but forgettable. It was poised to become one of the greatest deceptions of the war, a symphony of static played on strips of metal, conducted by a quiet genius whose weapon was an idea. The proposal, when it first landed on the polished oak desks of senior RAF commanders in early 1942, was met with a mixture of skepticism and outright derision. These were men who dealt in tangible power, in brute force arithmetic, the thunderous thrust of a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the earth-shattering detonation of a 4,000-pound cookie blast bomb, the mathematical certainty of a bomb sight. What was placed before them, typed neatly on a classified memorandum, was an almost childish concept, an insult to the grim seriousness of their trade. The secret superweapon, the proposed answer to the devastating German radar threat, was described in terms so simple they seemed absurd. Thin strips of aluminum foil, no different from the wrapping on a chocolate bar, cut to precise, specific lengths, like a dressmaker preparing a bizarre, metallic fabric, bundled into simple paper packets, resembling the payload of some enormous, destructive confetti cannon, and thrown, by hand, out of the bomber aircraft mid-flight by a crew member. That was it. No electronics, no moving parts, no explosives, just foil. To the battle-hardened officers, men who had seen wings sheared off by flak and cockpits turned to infernos by cannon fire, it sounded less like a war-winning strategy and more like a prank. One senior officer, a veteran of the First World War's aerial duels, is reported to have scoffed, "You want to fight the Luftwaffe by throwing rubbish at them? We might as well hurl insult." The idea seemed to belong in the realm of schoolboy science experiments, not the life and death calculus of strategic bombing. It felt like a desperate, almost pathetic gesture. But the men who proposed it were not pranksters. They were some of the brightest scientific minds in Britain, the boffins of the telecommunications research establishment, TRE, clandestine group of physicists, engineers, and mathematicians operating out of converted seaside hotels and country mansions, their minds focused on winning the war in the electromagnetic spectrum. And the science behind their simple proposal was as devastating as it was elegant. It was a principle known as radar resonance. The boffins, through painstaking intelligence work and captured equipment, knew the exact wavelengths of the German Wurzburg gun-laying and early warning radars. A radar set works by sending out pulses of radio energy and listening for the echo. By cutting the aluminum strips to exactly half the wavelength of the enemy's radar, they would create a perfect resonator in the air. When hit by the radar wave, the strip would re-radiate the energy, creating a powerful echo, far stronger than that of a mere aircraft. The magic, however, was in the multiplication. A single strip was a curiosity, but when a cloud of thousands of these strips was released from an aircraft, each one would reflect the radar pulse back to its source. the cumulative effect on the German operator's screen would be catastrophic. Instead of a single, sharp, purposeful blip representing a bomber, the screen would erupt into a storm of returns, a blizzard of light. It could look like a vast, sprawling armada of hundreds of bombers where only a dozen flew. Or it could create a single, massive, phantom echo that mimicked a giant, non-existent aircraft. Or, at its most effective, it could simply paint the entire screen with a shimmering curtain of static, a white noise, that completely masked the real aircraft flying within the electronic smokescreen. The German operator, peering into the hypnotic glow of his cathode ray tube, would be plunged into a state of informational chaos. His greatest asset, the technological gift of sight, would be rendered useless. He wouldn't know where to vector his fighters. The flak gunners on the ground, their predictors fed by radar data, would be firing blindly into an empty sky, their shells bursting amidst a cloud of metallic dust. The Luftwaffe's technological advantage, painstakingly built over years, was about to be neutralized not by a more powerful weapon, but by a shower of metallic confetti. The laughter in the room was about to die down, replaced by the quiet hum of a nation preparing to wage war with ghosts, and the frantic rustle of millions of aluminum strips being prepared for battle. Behind every great weapon of war, there is a mind, a singular intellect that sees a path where others see a dead end. For Project Window, that mind belonged to a man who was the antithesis of a military commander, a soft-spoken, bespectacled, and formidably brilliant physicist named Professor Reginald Victor Jones. In 1942, Jones was just 30 years old, but he held one of the most critical and clandestine posts in British intelligence, Assistant Director of Intelligence, Science, at the Air Ministry. He was not a man who commanded armies, but he commanded respect through the sheer, unassailable power of his reasoning. His office was a sanctuary of quiet thought amidst the clamor of war, a place where the secrets of the enemy were unraveled not with brute force, but with logic, intuition, and a deep, almost innate understanding of the laws of physics. He was a detective, and his beat was the ether. Jones had already earned his stripes in the secret war. He had been instrumental in deciphering the German, Nicobian, beam system, a radio guidance tool that allowed Luftwaffe bombers to navigate accurately to British cities during the Blitz. He had conceived of and executed a brilliant countermeasure, broadcasting deceptive signals that led German bombers astray, their bombs falling harmlessly in open countryside. He had then defeated the more advanced, X-Gerrit system, a battle of wits fought with oscilloscopes and calculus, arguably saving Coventry from even greater devastation. His was a mind that lived in the radio spectrum, a hunter of electronic secrets. The concept of using reflective strips to confuse radar was not, in itself, new. Jones and the German scientists had both independently discovered the principle years before the war. In fact, there was a silent, unspoken fear, a gentleman's agreement in a most ungentlemanly war, that held the British back from deploying it. It was the terrifying knowledge of reciprocity. If they used this simple, easily replicable technology against Germany, what was to stop the Luftwaffe from immediately turning it back on British defenses? The entire chain home radar network, Britain's vital early warning system that had won the Battle of Britain, could be rendered obsolete in a single night. It was a mutual assured disruption, our electronic sword of Damocles, and the British, reliant on their radar for the very island's survival, were hesitant to be the first to break the taboo. Jones, however, became Project Window's most powerful and persistent advocate. He argued with a quiet, relentless logic that wore down opposition. Intelligence, gathered through the miracle of ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park and daring low-level photo reconnaissance by Spitfires, was painting a clear and horrifying picture. The German night fighter defense, controlled by the sophisticated Himmelbett, four-poster bed, system, was becoming lethally efficient. The RAF was losing the night war. The cost of inaction was being measured in the lives of thousands of aircrew, in the charred bodies of men barely out of their teens. He presented his case not with bluster, but with cold, hard data. He explained the physics with elegant clarity, drawing diagrams of wavelengths and resonance. But his masterstroke was in orchestrating a series of breathtakingly audacious tests that moved the theory from the blackboard to the real world. On one occasion, a lone Bristol Beaufighter flew a specific course over a British chain home radar station. On Jones's signal, it released the foil strips. The seasoned operators on the ground were stunned to see their screens suddenly show an entire invasion fleet approaching the coast, a phantom armada of warships conjured from a few pounds of aluminum tossed from a single plane. The effect was irrefutable, a silent, electronic magic trick. Jones's triumph was in overcoming the paralysis of fear. He convinced the skeptics and the worried that the immediate, tangible threat of the German defenses outweighed the potential future risk. He argued that the Germans, with their rigid, centralized command structure and less integrated radar network, would be far more vulnerable to the chaos of Window than the more flexible, experienced British system. It was a colossal gamble, a high-stakes poker game with the nation's aerial defense as the chips, but Jones had done the math. He had peered into the future and seen that the risk of standing still was greater than the risk of moving forward. The war of the ether was about to begin, and he was its quiet, unassuming, and profoundly determined architect. Having proven the concept beyond any scientific doubt, Project Window entered a new and more frustrating phase for Jones and the scientists at Trey, the agonizing wait for political and military approval. The weapon was now trapped in a bureaucratic and strategic purgatory. It was a weapon proven to work in spectacular fashion, but one deemed too dangerous to unleash. It was a genie that everyone was afraid to let out of the bottle. The file, a thick folder of test results, scientific analyses, and grim casualty reports, circulated among the War Cabinet's most senior figures. It landed on the desk of the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Portal, a man acutely aware of the staggering losses in Bomber Command, who saw in Window a potential lifeline for his bleeding force. It was scrutinized by the formidable Lord Cherwell, Winston Churchill's influential and often dogmatic scientific advisor, who needed to be convinced of the risk-reward calculus. And ultimately, it found its way to the Prime Minister himself, the one man with the authority to roll the dice. The central, terrifying question remained, echoing in the committee rooms: what if the Germans retaliated in kind? Britain's survival in the dark days of 1940 had hinged on the chain home radar stations. These towering lattice masts along the coast, their signals stitching a protective web over the English Channel, had given RAF Fighter Command the precious minutes needed to scramble its Hurricanes and Spitfires to intercept incoming Luftwaffe formations. They were the nation's electronic shield. If the Germans, in response to a British window attack, simply copied the idea and showered the English Channel with their own Doppel, the German codename for the same technology, discovered independently by their scientists, the entire early warning system would be blinded. The Royal Navy's Channel patrols would be hamstrung. A new German bombing blitz could arrive without warning, its bombers appearing out of the static as suddenly as death itself. The memory of the blitz was still fresh, the scars on London and Coventry still raw. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in the stomach of every planner. The advocates for Window, Jones foremost among them, were, in the eyes of some, playing with existential fire. They were proposing to shatter the fragile, unspoken truce that had kept this particular demon in its box. For months, the debate raged in secret, smoke-filled committees. The scientists pushed for deployment, their arguments growing more urgent with every new Bomber Command loss report that crossed the desks. They presented new calculations, suggesting that the integrated German Himmelbett system was actually more vulnerable to this kind of disruption than Britain's more decentralized defenses. The Himmelbett system was a complex, interlocked chain. A ground-based Wurzburg radar would guide a fighter to a specific box of airspace, where the fighter's own, more precise airborne Liechtenstein radar would then take over for the final kill. It was a precision instrument. If the ground radar was blinded by a cloud of foil, the entire intricate dance fell apart. The night fighter would be left blind and alone in the vastness of the night sky, a knight-errant with no squire to guide him. Meanwhile, in the bomber stations scattered across the flat landscapes of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, the war continued its grim harvest. Aircrew, unaware of the secret weapon sitting on a shelf in Whitehall, continued to fly into the electronic kill zone over the Ruhr. They referred to the German radar-controlled searchlights that locked onto them with uncanny accuracy as master searchlights, and the flak that grew ever more accurate as predictive fire. They knew the odds were turning against them. They could feel the unseen eye upon them. The pressure mounted. The moral imperative to save the lives of these men began to outweigh the abstract fear of retaliation. Something had to give. The decision required the political courage and strategic audacity of only one man. Finally, in the summer of 1943, with a massive, sustained bombing campaign against the critical port city of Hamburg planned, codenamed Operation Gomorrah, the order was given. The risk was acknowledged, but the potential payoff, the chance to devastate a key German city and break the back of the night fighter force, was deemed worth the colossal gamble. After more than a year in limbo, Project Window was green-lit. The aluminium confetti was to be unleashed upon the Reich. The date was July 24, 1943. A sense of tense anticipation hung over the bomber bases of eastern England. The target, Hamburg, Germany's great port city, the gateway to the world, a hive of U-boat construction and war industry. The operation was codenamed Gomorrah, a name laden with biblical fury. For the first time, the men of Bomber Command were briefed on their strange new cargo. In the briefing huts, amidst the large maps covered in red ribbon and the meteorological reports, intelligence officers held up bundles of what looked like metallic bookmarks. There were murmurs of confusion, then astonishment, as the purpose was explained. The crews were given strict, almost surreal instructions: do not release the window until the precise moment ordered by the raid master over the radio, and under no circumstances were any packets to be brought back to base. Any unused were to be jettisoned over the sea on the return journey. The secret of the strip's exact length was paramount. If a crashed plane gave the Germans a sample, they could quickly calibrate their own countermeasures. As the first wave of 740 Lancasters droned across the moonlit North Sea that night, a palpable, nervous tension mixed with a flicker of unprecedented hope filled the cockpit. The intercom was quieter than usual. They were flying into the heart of one of the most heavily defended regions of the Third Reich, the Kammhuber Line, but they carried a new kind of shield. Then, as the German coast appeared as a dark smudge on the horizon, the order crackled over the VHF radio. The code word was given: release window. Throughout the vast bomber stream, crew members, usually the wireless operator or the navigator, tore open the brown paper packet. There was no dramatic sound, no explosion. Just a quiet, metallic rustle, like 1,000 snakes exhaling, as billions of foil strips caught the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream and blossomed into an immense, drifting cloud that stretched for miles behind the fleet. From the cockpits, crews could see the shimmering cloud catching the moonlight, a beautiful, ethereal phenomenon that belied its destructive purpose. The effect on the German defenses was instantaneous and total. Chaos, pure and simple, descended upon the Reich's air defense network. In the Himmelbett control bunkers, the glowing radar screens dissolved into meaningless madness. One veteran German radar operator later described the sight with a kind of terrified poetry, calling it a migration of angels, a beautiful and utterly useless phrase for the electronic hell he was witnessing. His screen showed not a neat stream of bomber blips, but a solid, crawling wall of light. It was impossible to distinguish a single aircraft. The ground controllers, their primary eyes put out, were rendered mute, their voices rising in pitch and panic over the comms channels. They could no longer guide their night fighters. The system of precise interceptions, of vectors and altitudes, collapsed into informational anarchy. On the ground, the master searchlights wavered, their beams crisscrossing the sky in helpless confusion, unable to find a target to lock onto. The predicted flak bursts, once concentrated and deadly, became sporadic and wild, firing into empty patches of sky where the window cloud had drifted, a phantom fleet drawing the enemy's fire. The real bombers flew on, largely untouched, to deliver the devastating payloads on Hamburg. The real horror for the Germans, however, was in the cockpits of their night fighters. The pilots of the Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s, orbiting patiently in their assigned boxes, heard only static and the confused, panicked voices of their controllers over their radios. Their own airborne Liechtenstein radar sets, when switched on, were immediately swamped by the echo storm, their scopes showing targets everywhere and nowhere at once. They were blind, deaf, and utterly useless. One frustrated German pilot was heard to radio his controller, "I am in the middle of an enemy fleet. I can see them all around me." He was seeing nothing but empty sky and the psychological phantom of the blizzard on his scope. One RAF pilot recalled the surreal experience: "We looked down and saw it all happening. The searchlights and the flak were all concentrated on one patch of sky to our port side, a real fireworks display. But there was nothing there. Absolutely nothing. Just our window. It was the oddest thing I ever saw in the war." The results were beyond anyone's most optimistic hopes. Bomber command losses for that first window-protected raid were a fraction of what was expected for a raid on a target of Hamburg's caliber. The psychological blow to the German air defense was profound. The commander of the German night fighters, General Joseph Kammhuber, saw his entire, meticulously constructed system, the product of years of work, rendered obsolete in a single night. It was a masterstroke of scientific warfare. The subsequent firestorm that engulfed Hamburg, a cataclysm of biblical proportions born of concentrated bombing and perfect conditions, was a direct, terrible consequence of the accuracy and concentration that window allowed. The RAF had, for the first time, achieved a form of temporary but absolute air superiority, not by destroying the enemy's planes on the ground or in the air, but by stealing their sight, by plunging them into an electronic dark age. In the aftermath of the first Hamburg raid, a stunned silence fell over the German high command, followed by a storm of fury, panic, and frantic activity. The initial reports from the radar stations and flak units were dismissed as mass hysteria or gross incompetence. But as debriefs from confused fighter pilots and radar operators piled up, the truth became undeniable, and it was a chilling one. The British had broken the unspoken rule. They had deployed Duppel. The electronic taboo had been shattered. For General Kamhuber, it was a professional and personal catastrophe. His entire Himmelbett system, his life's work, a complex and elegant solution to the problem of night defense, was built on the foundation of ground-controlled interception. With that foundation now turned to electronic quicksand, his system was not just damaged, it was fundamentally broken. He pleaded with the Luftwaffe High Command for resources to develop a technical countermeasure, new radar sets with frequency hopping capabilities, but the damage to his reputation was done. In the brutal politics of the Nazi regime, failure was never tolerated. His star fell rapidly within the Luftwaffe hierarchy. In this crisis of defense, a new, radically different tactic was rushed into service. It was the brainchild of a brilliant, unorthodox, and fiercely ambitious fighter pilot named Major Harjo Herman. A former bomber pilot who had led raids on London, Herman possessed a maverick's mind. He had conceived of a method that bypassed radar entirely, a tactic born of sheer desperation and lateral thinking. His idea was brutally simple: send masses of single-engine day fighters, the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and powerful Focke-Wulf FW-190s, over the British target city itself. There, they would operate not by electronic guidance from the ground, but visually, like moths drawn to a flame, hunting in the light of the very destruction the RAF was causing. The technique was codenamed Wild Sow, Wild Boar. The German reaction to Window was a testament to their resilience and ingenuity, but it was a reaction born of desperation. They had been forced to abandon their sophisticated, scientific system for a chaotic, medieval free-for-all. The British had not only blinded the enemy, they had forced him to change the very rules of the game, leading him into a new kind of battle where the advantages were far less certain and the costs, in men and machines, were now being transferred onto their own side. The duel had simply moved to a new, more brutal arena, lit by the fires of Germany's own burning cities. The impact of Project Window rippled far beyond the fire-blackened ruins of Hamburg or the night skies over Berlin. It had proven a revolutionary principle, one that would echo through the decades, that in the modern electronic age, a deception could be as potent as a destruction. It was the birth of modern electronic warfare. The immediate, tangible effect was a dramatic and sustained reduction in Bomber Command's casualty rate. While the Germans adapted with Wild Sow and later, more sophisticated radar systems like the SN2 which operated on a different, harder-to-jam frequency, the initial, overwhelming advantage given by Windows saved an estimated 4,500 aircraft and the lives of up to 30,000 aircrew over the remainder of the war. It allowed Sir Arthur Harris's bomber force to continue its controversial but relentless campaign with a survivability that had previously seemed like a distant dream. It was, quite simply, a force multiplier of incalculable value. Strategically, Window forced a fundamental and costly shift in German war production and scientific research. Vast resources were diverted from bomber production and other vital fronts to build thousands of new single-engine fighters for the Wild Sow units. Scientists and engineers at Telefunken and other firms, who could have been working on offensive projects or other defensive technologies, were now scrambling in a crash program to create new radar sets immune to jamming. It sparked a technological arms race in the ether, a race the resource-strapped Germans were destined to lose. The mere existence of Window had forced the Luftwaffe onto the back foot, reacting rather than acting. But the true legacy of those simple aluminum strips lies in the paradigm they established. Project Window was the direct ancestor of every modern electronic countermeasure, ECM. The chaff dispensers on a modern fighter jet, the jamming pods that disrupt enemy communications, the stealth technology designed to absorb radar waves rather than reflect them, all of them trace the conceptual lineage back to those paper packets tossed from Lancaster flare shoots. It was the moment warfare truly entered the information age, where controlling the enemy's perception of the battlefield became as important as controlling the battlefield itself. The story of Project Window is not one of a decisive battle or a single, glorious victory. It is a story of intellect over instinct, of cunning over cannon. It is the story of a quiet man, Reginald Jones, who understood that the most powerful weapon is sometimes not a bigger explosion, but a better idea. He changed the course of the war without firing a shot, without personally downing a single enemy plane. His battlefield was the realm of physics, his ammunition was knowledge,